Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. I'm Lydia, the Halfling Seamstress. So I love history bounding, which is taking elements of historical dress, whether it be silhouette, fabrics, jewelry, hairstyles, whatever, and finding ways to incorporate them into varying degrees of a more modern look. History bounding was inspired as a spin-off of Disney bounding, where you dress in similar colors or similar feel of a Disney character without actually cosplaying as said character, because if you're an adult, that can get you kicked out of the park. I've been looking for some comfy, 3-season shirts that I can wear to work, out for a walk, or just around the house. And so today I'm going to take the bounding concept one step further and try fantasy bounding. Creating outfits for everyday wear based off characters from fantasy movies and TV shows without actually doing a full cosplay. Now don't get me wrong, I love me some epic flowing sleeves and floor-length velvet gowns, but they're really not practical when your day job is at a horse barn. So today's project is inspired by the fantasy woodsman, the ranger, the explorer, the guy who's going to ride 3 leagues before nightfall. That's what I need. So in a similar idea as my handkerchief video, I'm going to make 2 history/fantasy inspired shirts based on 2 different outdoorsy fantasy characters. One shirt will be entirely hand sewn and the other will be mostly machine sewn. My first inspiration comes from the 2008 TV show Legend of the Seeker. It was cheesy and wildly deviated from the book series, but the costuming was pretty awesome. Now I would love to have Kaylin's white confessor dress, but again, practicality here, I'm looking at Richard Cypher's signature slate blue linen shirt. Thankfully I found an image online that gives a good look at its construction, and it's actually pretty close to a medieval tunic, which means it's going to be mostly squares and triangles. There's the main body piece, sleeves that are technically wrist length but are wide enough to roll up to the elbow, and underarm gussets for freedom of movement, especially important if you're going to be fighting Daharans. And since showing off your pecs is hot when you're Richard Cypher but frowned on when you're a woman, I'm going to be making the cut of the keyhole neckline a lot higher up. I was able to find a lovely linen online that matches color and weight near perfectly. Since it's all squares and rectangles, and because I like my projects taking twice as long as they need to, I'm thread pulling to make sure I'm cutting right on the grain. Necessary? No. Kinda cool and satisfying? Yes. The gussets I cut out in squares, and then cut them in half to make triangles that will go on either side of the sleeve. For basic medieval tunics like this, I like sewing the gussets on flat instead of wrangling them to opposite corners. So as you can see here, the gussets were pretty big. Too big, in fact. After I had sewn them on, I held them up to my arm and realized they were going to look stupid and hamper my movement. So I ended up cutting them down by almost half the size, and that worked so much better. For the neckline, I wanted to go with a keyhole style, and I ended up using one of my favorite shirts to get the proportions right, instead of worrying about doing the math separately. I traced the outline of the neck, found the center point, and then made sure to mark where the 2/3 mark was as well. When you're sewing a shirt, you don't actually want the collar to sit exactly at the middle length, otherwise it will slip to the back, and it'll make the shoulders look weird and be really uncomfortable, and it'll just not be good. So you actually want the collar to sit with approximately 1/3 to the back of center and 2/3 to the front of center. I also measured how far down I wanted the keyhole to go. I thought I wanted it further down, but ended up shortening it by half the length. I marked 1 inch around every side for seam allowance and cut out my new pattern. I then made a quick mock-up to be sure the neckline would look the way I wanted it to. The mock-up worked perfectly, so I went straight ahead to cutting it out of the actual fabric. And I made sure to mark the seam lines to be certain I was stitching in exactly the right places. I marked the center of the fabric and made sure to place the neckline in the proper place, 1/3 to the back, 2/3 to the front, lots of pins to hold it in place, and we're ready to sew. So this may look odd, but it works for a reason. When making a keyhole neckline, you actually need to sew the facing to the body of the shirt before you cut out the middle. As it is, it behaves like a whole piece of fabric and there is no bias warping. As soon as you cut it out on the curve, it will warp and stretch and just be a mess to sew with, and your garment will not sit right. So after stitching almost the entire way around the circle, stitch down the center line, but slightly off center, like maybe 1/8 of an inch away. You want one stitch at the bottom to secure, but not more than one stitch. Then go back up to join the circle, again staying close to the center, but not directly on it. Now that the seam line is sewn down, I cut out the neck. You still want to cut it in fairly close to the sewing line, but not so close you snip any threads. And then I carefully snip down the middle. Then the facing gets turned over. Since this is medium weight linen, I'm steaming and ironing as I turn the edges in. Most times you want to turn the facing into the wrong side, so it's less visible. However, since Richard's shirt actually has the facing as a simple trim, I'm turning it to the right side of the fabric and keeping it visible. Because the two fabric pieces are essentially the exact same shape and size, there shouldn't be any warping. They should just sit perfectly one on top of the other. The facing gets stitched down with little felling stitches. I did a few extra little stitches at the bottom of the neckline to secure it. Then I pinned on the sleeves and stitched them down with back stitches. Then I made that revelation about them being too big, unpicked all my hand sewing, cut them down, sewed them back on, and stitched up the body. Linen is one of those fabrics that frays like crazy, so all the raw edges got felled down. And then the bottom hem and sleeves get turned under and hemmed down with whip stitches. And that's it. That's essentially all it takes to make a basic medieval tunic that can be adapted for any number of fantasy characters. Let's go on an adventure.
There's a quad of Daharans up ahead. If we're careful, we can sneak up on them and catch them unaware. Now!
So, lessons learned with this shirt. Number 1, gussets don't need to be as big on this style as they do with 18th century pirate shirts. Number 2, measure twice, cut once. I was 99% sure I had written down the length I wanted the shirt to be, including the seam allowance, and I was 99% sure I measured and cut the length I wanted, plus seam allowance. It seems I didn't, since it feels shorter than I wanted. I wasn't looking for a knee-length tunic, but it's definitely a bit shorter than some of my other favorite shirts, and I'm not quite sure what went wrong. I like this shirt, but there's something finicky about it that's keeping it out of the love it category. Number 3, despite making the keyhole neckline higher up than I had originally planned, it is still lower and a bit more gappy than I wanted. I think it has something to do with the weight of the fabric, but I might add a couple hidden hooks and eyes just so I can do it up a little higher if need be. It looks cool, but a little too low cut for my comfort, especially since I had originally planned to wear this when working with clients on horseback. That being said, it is heckin' comfy and great for a cool campfire night. Last time I was up at the cabin, I ended up sleeping in it, and let me tell you, linen makes really comfy pajamas. For my second shirt, I'm taking inspiration from Aragorn's red tunic in Lord of the Rings. We don't get to see a lot of this tunic since it's usually covered by his jerkin and coat, but we do get a nice shot of the whole thing by itself when Elrond visits the camp at Dunharrow in Return of the King. From the occasional close-up, we can see that it is also a keyhole neckline with a bit of leather trim around the edge. I'm foregoing the leather trim since I want this to be simple and doing inspired by versus actual replica. For this shirt, I'm going to be using this red viscose, aka rayon, that I picked up in my first ever trip to the Toronto Garment District in very early 2020. I'm going to construct it in pretty much the same way as the first one, except I'm doing this one mostly by machine. Because the first shirt turned out a little shorter than I wanted, I decided to make this one even longer. So I went from selvage to selvage, making it approximately 30 inches long when lying flat. I also want to apologize before we get further into this video. My camera, for whatever reason, did not like filming red viscose. So if it seems at all grainy and fuzzy, it's because my camera was having a hissy fit. I used the same keyhole neckline pattern and placed it centered on the body, but again, 2/3 to the front. I made sure to mark out the seam lines again, and then took it to my machine to sew. And then, because my machine decided to be a pain in the butt and not maintain the proper tension, I decided to sew in the neckline by hand. The neckline gets cut out and then turned under as with the first shirt. This time I wanted to do something a little different and decided not to go with the leather trim, instead top stitching the neckline down. I sewed one line very close to the seam to hold everything in place, and then turned the collar under again and top stitched a bit further out to secure the turned under edges and finish it off nicely. Then it's time for the sleeves again. Because viscose is a fine fabric and I didn't want any stitches showing on the right side of the fabric, I opted to finish my seams on this shirt with French seams. You start with the fabric wrong sides together, opposite of normal, stitch them together, then trim the seam down, fold it over, and stitch along the seam line from the right side. If it sounds like I'm not explaining that very well, it's because I barely understand them myself. Once the gussets are sewn on the sleeves, I pin them to the shirt and stitch them down. And because no sewing project is complete without messing something up, I did the French seams inside out on one sleeve. So I unpicked said sleeve, flipped it over to the other side, and did the French seam all over again. Then I folded the shirt in half, matched up the sides, and pinned all the way down. I started sewing at the sleeve cuff as I wanted to make sure they matched, and it would be much easier to trim a bit of body if something went slightly off. And if you thought I learned my lesson about making sure the French seam was started with the proper sides together, you'd be wrong. I got all the way stitched down before realizing it was inside out of what it should be. Cue more seam ripping and under the breath grumbling. But after that, the first side came together nicely. And then when it came to the second side, I kind of didn't film it because I was tired and fed up and I just wanted the shirt to be done. Because when I was pinning all the way down, I realized when I got to the bottom that I had made yet another mistake. You see, this was the side where I had sewn the sleeve on inside out earlier, the side that I thought was centered at the shoulder, the side that turned out to be about an inch off center, making the bottom of the shirt hang at a stupid angle. So I had to unpick the sleeve seam once more, reset it to be centered, sew it back in place, and then I could sew up the second side of the shirt, which thankfully I did correctly, because if I hadn't, I might have cried. And because I had had quite enough of my sewing machine, thank you very much, and I wanted to catch up on some YouTube videos, I decided to hand fell my sleeve cuffs and hem. A very relaxing way to end the project. So, Lessons learned on this shirt. Number 1, Viscose is slippery but amazing. Number 2, make sure your sleeves are set in properly the first time. Number 3, if I ever talk about wanting to make something with French seams again, please give me a smack upside the head. This project reminded me of why I either fell or top stitch all my seams. I know it is a useful method for finishing seams, especially with lightweight materials, but they gave me far more of a headache than they were worth. So, with shirt complete and lessons learned, it's time for another adventure.